to a program sponsored by Congregation Beth Shalom's Adult Education Committee. And on behalf of Simon Klarfeld and Mikhail Rauscher, I am Dennis Klein, and again want to welcome you to an important program. It's the classic bittersweet moment for us. We are welcoming back Beth to our community. And at the same time, we're talking about a subject that is very difficult to actually return to for the obvious reasons. But, you know, we are really virtually 2 years out from the tragedy that occurred on October 27, 2018. As the great writer Toni Morrison had said in her remarkable work, Beloved, this is really an example of emotional memory for all of us. We are still living in the aftermath, and it's difficult to recall it, as I was saying, but it's always important to reflect. I can only say that in my own personal experience, when the incident occurred, my cousin was visiting me, who resides in Pittsburgh and is a member of Dor Hadash, which is one of the 3 synagogues that constitute the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. And the moment that she received the call, it was really a very dark moment for her and for all of us from that point on. I actually felt compelled, in light of that moment, to write an op-ed piece called Degrees of Separation, and how close we all are to these tragedies as it occurred, certainly for me, and I'm sure for many of us. And so this is an opportunity, therefore, to reflect, and we are honored and fortunate to have with us the editor of a volume to work through and to think about this tragedy together as a community, called Bound in the Bond of Life, Pittsburgh Writers Reflect on the Tree of Life tragedy, which I believe, Beth, was released just a couple of days ago officially. And so we're really at the cutting edge of some of your important work. Beth earned her BA from Columbia College and her PhD in comparative literature at the University of Pennsylvania. She taught at a number of colleges and universities, including the historically Black college, Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, at Smith and Mount Holyoke colleges, and at the University of Minnesota. She currently lives in Pittsburgh with her family. She works as a journalist and writes regularly in Tablet, The Forward, the New York Jewish Week, the New York Times, Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post, and the Jerusalem Report. She has had writers' residencies at the Corporation of Yaddo, the Ragdale Foundation, and the Virginia Center for Creative Arts. And so before I turn it over to you, Beth, just a few of the usual ground rules to please mute yourself if you haven't already, that the questions that will no doubt emerge in the course of her presentation, you can place into the chat box. And then when we are at that point of our program tonight, we'll have an opportunity to address your questions. I believe, Beth, we had set this up for my playing the role of a moderator to begin to ask you some questions. Do you want to proceed accordingly, or do you want to say a few introductory remarks?
Yeah, I mean, you said that you wanted to ask me about my memories of Beth Shalom. You wanted me to start off with that.
Why don't you go with the at-home question? Yeah.
Well, Beth Shalom was a very different place when my family moved to Teaneck in 1976. It wasn't egalitarian. My mother wore a tallis. Not everybody was happy about that. So that, took some time, I think, for us to be accepted. My fondest memory of Hebrew school, which my parents will corroborate, is that we told our teacher that we were not allowed to write on Sunday because it was a day after the Sabbath and we needed to extend the sanctity of the Sabbath. We were very, very key on that. And the sad part is that she believed us. So that was her Israeli education. So that was basically my fond memories of Hebrew school, how many kunsim and pranks we could play on our teachers. I think we were more successful with some than with others, but so I can't say that I got a great deal of education. But some nice memories, some friendships I still have. Someone else in my Hebrew school class, David Gordon, is also a writer, and he always wanted to be a writer as a kid. So it was very exciting to see, on Facebook that he actually did become a writer. So I would say, Beth Shalom didn't contribute so much to my Jewish education. I really loved going to Camp Vermont in the Poconos. That was very important to me. And I also worked at Ramon Palmer for 2 summers. And actually it was at Ramon Palmer that I met the first person from Pittsburgh that I ever knew. And when I did a program at Penn earlier this week, there was a question asked by a Penn first-year student who said her father grew up in Squirrel Hill. And who was that person? It was none other than my friend from Ramon Palmer, who grew up in Squirrel Hill. And where does he live now? Take a guess. Teaneck, of course. So Ramon, there's just the small worldness of everything. He and I switched places. I live in Squirrel Hill and he lives in Teaneck. So Ramon, I think, was more on my family and their experiences in the Chabura movement before we moved to Teaneck was, I think, more formative in my Jewish education than Beth Shalom at the time, although Beth Shalom has changed a lot. One memory I do have, I remember, I think I was a senior in high school. There was one Shavuos where a Holocaust horror was dedicated, and all the survivors in the congregation, maybe if anyone here who was there wants to corroborate this, I think I'm right. But all the survivors in the congregation walked in holding this Torah, and it was a very powerful and meaningful moment to me that I've sort of kept with me. And thought about a lot in a variety of ways. And, I guess that I too am sort of holding that up in editing this book and putting it out there. One thing I do hope, I was just told that the book sold out in a very non-Jewish neighborhood of Pittsburgh called Sewickley. It sold out of the bookstore there. And, I really hope that some of the teachings of Judaism get communicated to the broader world. So I think, metaphorically, I'm also trying to hold the Torah and pass it on, just like the survivors I thought Beth Shalom did.
Yep. So, Beth, if you can, since you're a resident of Pittsburgh, you live in Pittsburgh, can you tell us, and if you want to consult some personal experiences to answer this question, what exactly happened 2 years ago and the immediate impact it had on the Pittsburgh Jewish and the larger greater Pittsburgh community?
Sure. Well, I think, I plan to do this to read some selections from essays. So why don't I start out with the first essay and tell you a little about the anthology, and then I'll answer the question. I think that'll be a fun way to do the program. So the first essay in the book is called Here is Squirrel Hill, and it's a take on E.B. White's Here is New York. And we ended up dividing the anthology into 3 sections. So the first section is Here is Squirrel Hill, and it's essays that describe what the neighborhood is like in some ways. So there's an essay by someone who's a lifelong Tree of Life member. There's an essay by someone who is a historian who wrote about all of the artifacts that were left at the site. There were hundreds of, maybe not hundreds, but I think so. There were many, many objects left at the site by all different kinds of people, and they've been processed and put in the archive at the Heinz History Center. We have a Jewish archive, and my co-editor is the archivist at the Jewish Archive in the Heinz History Center. So one of the essays is about all of the objects that were left at the site and the stories behind the people who left them and why they felt moved to leave the objects and what those objects symbolize for them. There's also an essay by a professional journalist who lives 400 feet from the Tree of Life building, and what it was like for her to cover the event and how it helped her recall all of the other different kinds of murder scenes that she's covered over her life as a journalist. So there's a variety of essays in that section. There's an essay by someone who is Shomer Shabbat, and she talks about walking to shul that day and hearing the sirens, but not having means to, check any kind of news site. And she walked past stores where people were checking their phones, but she didn't want to ask anybody what happened, and sort of the interplay between kind of keeping Shabbat and not knowing what's happening, but needing to know what's happened. And her final realization that holding on to traditional Jewish observance is a kind of defiance of what the shooter was trying to do, and just how important it was for her to continue her observance, for her and her family not to turn on the TV or look at their phones or watch the news. So there's a variety of essays in that section. I'm going to read now from the first essay by Molly Pascal, and I'm just going to read Molly's bio. Molly Pascal is a freelance writer, native Pittsburgher, and member of Tree of Life. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, Lit Hub, the New York Times, Newsweek, Huffington Post, Salon, the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle, the Pittsburgh Post Gazette, and Akashic Books, among others. Her short stories and essays have received awards or honorable mention from Glimmer Train, Profane, and Pen Parentis. Here's Squirrel Hill, and I'm just going to read the epigraph from E.B. White so you get a sense. It is a battered tree, long-suffering and much climbed, held together by strands of wire, but beloved of those who know it. In a way, it symbolizes the city, life under difficulties, growth against odds, saprise in the midst of concrete, and the steady reaching for the sun. So now I'm going to read Molly Pascal's essay, Here is Squirrel Hill, September 2018. Cecil Rosenthal, giant and smiling, looms in the door in his usual place as usher and greeter to all who enter. His gentle presence, so constant from year to year that I think of him as a physical element of the building, a Doric column of a man. I scan the seats, looking for family and friends. On Kol Nidre, every Jew comes to shul. On Kol Nidre, we come in droves, except not anymore. On what should be the busiest night of the year, the sanctuary looks largely empty. As I stand at the entrance, I stare and wonder if I've gotten something wrong. Once upon a time, I would not have had a choice of where to sit. I would have carefully guarded my ticket or searched for a space among the 600 to squeeze in. But times have changed. Conservative Judaism has been on a downswing, with congregations everywhere losing and fighting for members. I joined my brother Sam and his wife Andy in a pew near the front of the main sanctuary. Audrey, our Lilliputian and Ruth Bader Ginsburg lookalike cantor this evening, barely clears the podium. This is her annual gig, singing the opening vows. She pauses briefly, allowing us to cough and shuffle before raising her voice for the crescendo of her third repetition. I hear the voices around me, chanting the Al-Chet, the communal recitation of transgression, and for the sin which we have committed before you in passing judgment. As I ask to be sealed in the book of life for the next year, I'm not feeling very pious. Instead, I'm thinking that I don't really know this fairly new rabbi up there gracing the bima. I'm thinking about how long it will be before I can sit down, and that I'm not even an hour into the fast and I'm thirsty. I'm thinking that modern American sanctuaries are all rather ugly. They bear the architectural hallmarks of post-war modern design, lots of concrete, industrial carpet, and clean lines. The growing darkness of dusk paints the windows, obscuring the gem-colored stained glass. Most of all, I'm questioning why I am here. For those who are not from here, it's first necessary to explain what here is. There are roughly 3 Pittsburghs. There is the Pittsburgh of the indigenous, the person who is born here and remains here. In that category, too, are the boomerangs, the ones who left for various reasons and intervals, then returned to stay. Second, there is the Pittsburgh of those who moved here and who, no matter how long their tenure, will always find that demerit part and parcel of their status. Third, there is the Pittsburgh of the diaspora, those who claim a spiritual residence in lieu of a current address. Pittsburgh is not so much a city as an amalgamation of neighborhoods formed by immigration and migration. Italian Morningside and Bloomfield, Black Hill District and Homestead, Irish North Side, and so on. While time has softened those definitions and borders, they remain impervious pockets. About 4 miles east of downtown live the vast majority of the area's Jews. Here is Squirrel Hill, an urban shtetl so natural and commonplace that I never knew it was a shtetl. It is pickles and babka and rye. It is statuesque oaks, maples, and London planes clipped and compromised for the electric wires. It is kosher pizza and donuts. It is busy at 7 a.m. with morning minyan traffic. It is 13 congregations of 4 denominations in 2 square miles. Walk another mile and you get another 2. The outdoor Chanukiah is permanent, not one seasonally affixed to a chassid's car. It's a public clock rendered in Hebrew. Little hand on Aleph marks the hours, steeple high over the Jewish Community Center. At the age of 6, I ventured alone up street for the first time, following a 2-block urban trail from my parents' home on Marlborough Road to Carnegie Library and the candy store. The shortcut required a shimmy past dilapidated garages, then a trespass along the deteriorating condos where Forbes Terrace used to be. The condos have been renovated, the garages torn down. Now at 46, I walk the same old route. Progress flows at the hiss of a 61C bus. I slip around the knot of Oakland-bound international students, then I'm forced to stop. I wait, like I've always waited, at a sacrosanct square, the 4-way walk and compass points of all who call this home, the intersection of Murray and Forbes. A flash of white, a high-pitched beep, then we will go at once, right, left, diagonally. One driver has violated the double line, but a pedestrian pushes him back with a punishing scowl. On I go, passing stores, coffee, bikes, candy, books, bagels, banks, bars, ice cream, and restaurants. Lebanese, Taiwanese, Japanese, Thai, Indian, Greek, Turkish, Mexican, pizza, pizza, pizza. I see geriatrics inching toward the Imperial House, lines and pancake gridlock at Pamela's, flocks of yeshiva girls in long navy skirts, strollers battling for sidewalk space, hipsters seeking vintage clothes or vinyl LPs, modern Orthodox boys shooting hoops, trailing tzitzit like spaghetti, cognoscenti at the Manor Theater, revelry on Simchat Torah, parades on Yom HaAtzmaut, and silence on Yom Kippur. It is our way to describe places by what came before. That is where Isleys used to be, by the old Poli's, where the old food land was. Perhaps even more remarkably, everyone understands. Used to be is our geography. It is the semantics of belonging, the archaeology of sedentary generations, and the rhetoric of an insular people. For newcomers, the young and progressives, this attitude can be frustrating and off-putting, but it also speaks to a community who, though slow to pledge, are loyal once they do, who are not so much resistant as cautious with the heart. In Squirrel Hill, you are always someone's granddaughter or grandson, son or daughter, mother or father, cousin, coworker, doctor, neighbor, or friend. My pediatrician's son became my nephew's pediatrician. We gave birth to our children at McGee. We buried our grandparents, then our parents, at Sugars. My daughter will go to school where I went to school, where my mother went to school. My childhood friend is the school nurse. My 2nd grade class photo hangs on the wall in her office. When we meet someone new, we interrogate. Do you know so-and-so? How about so-and-so? No, well, you should. We welcome the stranger, but hasten to dispose of that title. If New York bestows the gift of loneliness, Squirrel Hill wards against it. Intrusion and concern are its gifts. To live here requires participation, whether you like it or not. New Yorkers are created every day. We require a lifetime. For those of us who've always lived in Squirrel Hill, your shul is more of an inheritance than a choice. Growing up, my brother Sam and I spent our Saturdays at the other conservative synagogue, Beth Shalom. My father never advanced beside that ish subset of the 3 times a year Jews, but cancer largely stopped my parents' participation. When Sam married Andy, a Tree of Life girl, we all followed. The rows of Goodmans, Ryavs, and Zimmermans expanded to include Shackners and Pascals, then another generation of each. Over the years, however, I found conventional prayer unsatisfying and yearned for alternate ways of being Jewish. Eventually, my husband Matt and I enrolled our children in a Jewish day school, a community that increasingly fulfilled both their and my secular and religious needs. Sam, however, continued to find comfort in tradition. As the years passed, he attended shul more and more, I less and less. I even flirted with the idea of quitting. Then one day, Sam called to tell me that he was going to be president of Tree of Life. Why? I asked. They asked me if I would. There's no one else. But why? My wife had her bat mitzvah at Tree of Life. I was married at Tree of Life, Sam said. I hope my sons could have their bar mitzvahs at Tree of Life. You're crazy, I replied. You can't save conservative Judaism. I'm stubborn, he said. A childhood of irritation offered me a surplus of evidence on that front. I know some things need to change, he said. I'm going to try. How long is the term? 2 years. I contemplated this. To be stubborn about change is an act of hope. Perhaps I needed to try too. All right, I said, I'll give it 2 more years. The Squirrel Hill grapevine works quickly. Again and again, friends and acquaintances from the community stopped me to share their opinion about Sam's new role. Tell Sam that we're all sorry. Should we offer him congratulations or condolences? Mazel tov? It was a good thing Sam had never cared about power or recognition, since he'd taken on a job and a position nobody wanted. The questions about why I am here at Kol Nidre at Tree of Life leave my mind as Rabbi Myers motions for the crowd to sit. Sam heads to the microphone and speaks, pleading with members to tell him how he can help them. As he promises not to ask for the money the congregation so desperately needs to survive, my attention involuntarily returns to the ceiling. It is browned with water damage, pocked with missing panels, flaking drywall like sunburned skin. Buckets are set out to catch dripping rainwater. My head pings with Sam's words from an earlier private conversation. One of the first things we need to do is replace the roof.
So Beth, this evocative essay about Squirrel Hill, I happen to know it myself a bit, is really, I think, spot on. It really is a very tight, I mean, you know it from the inside, but that's certainly the impression you can hardly miss when you're visiting. And, it leads me to that next question. I think you actually used the word emptiness or empty, or recited those words as you read this passage. And I can't help but asking you this question, and something that you and I talked about actually in preparation for this evening, but is there a community, informal community response? Or to go just a little bit, I guess, deeper, is there a kind of a PTSD community-wide behavior that you feel or observe or have talked about?
Well, I think everybody in the community feels the trauma, Jews and non-Jews. I remember taking my daughter to her pediatrician sometime in the year after, and so this was before the pandemic. The pediatrician said, anytime I go into a crowd, I always think about how can I get out? What's the exit? How would I escape? If I go to a movie or a concert or anywhere, I think everybody in the community has this sense of danger and needing to know how to flee wherever you are. So, I think that surprised me that, even someone who's not Jewish, not going into a synagogue, but just this sense everywhere in the neighborhood, people feel this trauma. But, numerous times people stopped me on the street and talked to me. A neighbor of mine said his son they're members of Tree of Life. So it's, Magia Lahem. But, his son's always had anxiety, but it's gotten a lot worse. He really, isn't sure, how to treat it. And, it's just very difficult. He has difficulty sleeping. I think people in different ways physically feel it. People have told me, they didn't have they have migraines. They hadn't had them for a long time. They've come back. Or people with stomach pains, their stomach pains have come back. I mean, there's definitely all kinds of physical symptoms that people here feel. But, in terms of community response, it's been really heartening. Every part of the community has really done things in different ways to respond. The evening after the shooting, October 28th, 2018, there was a big gathering at Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall, which is a big public hall at the University of Pittsburgh. And I don't know if it seats 1,000 people, 1,500, 2,000. It's a very large hall. It was completely full. There were people outside in the rain, maybe 500 people outside also. And there were clergy of all faiths. there were Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims and a representative of the Chinese American Business Association came up to my husband. So really every part of the community came out to support us. Our synagogue had a relationship with an African-American church in East Liberty, the Rodman Street Missionary Baptist Church, and they did a service for us on October 31st, a few days after the shooting. It was beautiful. 11 African-American ministers lit yahrzeit candles, and each one gave a speech. And every time one of them spoke, I thought, this is incredibly beautiful. You know, there's nothing they can say that'll be more beautiful. And the next one spoke, and the next one spoke. And in this African-American church, the mayor and the chief of police came, and the chief of police got a standing ovation. Although an African-American 18-year-old had been killed in June 2018, a few months before, and unfortunately the policeman who killed him was acquitted. This was before the trial, but you know, in a church where there are tensions between the community and the police, the chief of police got an ovation because of what they'd done to save the people in the synagogue. And there were 4 policemen that were seriously wounded. One of them just returned to work like 2 or 3 weeks ago, so very recently. So yeah, so we felt very supported by the community. Certainly, you know, everybody in the community felt it in different ways, but it's a scary thing.
Yeah, that's, by the way, one of the remarkable things that I've noted is just what you're referring to, how folks from different backgrounds and traditions and religious faiths really came together in a remarkable way, speaking of community. So it kind of leads to this word that comes across so frequently in this context, which is resilience. And I know that that's something that you've taken a great interest in, and having that support expressed is certainly one of the attributes of resilience. Are there other examples that you have noted that what qualify to a form of healing, or is it too early to talk about healing?
Yeah, I think, yeah, you know, I just finished writing an essay. It's really interesting when you look at Kohelet, you know, in chapter 3, they're all the opposites. And do you know what the opposite, there's 8 laharog, and do you know what the opposite of harog is? The opposite of killing is? It's 8 lirpo, to heal. So I thought that was very interesting that healing is the opposite of killing, because you'd think that it would be, you know, to be born, to give birth, something like that, you know, but it's not. You know, the first one is, you know, time to be born, a time to die, but there's a time to kill and a time to heal. And I've been thinking about that. And I think, you know, the thing about killing is that there's violence, and healing implies some kind of, so we here had a Torah study session yesterday, you know, by Zoom, and we had a chance to hear from Rachel Sprecher Frankel, who's a teacher of Torah at Matan and at Nishmat in Israel, and her son Naftali was one of the 3 boys killed in 2014 in Israel, if you remember. And so she told us in this Torah study yesterday, she talked about the idea of rectification. And I guess I'm thinking about healing as a kind of rectification, you know, that if there's killing and violence, there needs to be some kind of rectification in order to heal. And I just don't think we're quite there yet. I think it takes some time. We do have, there's a grant, I think it's a federal grant. We have something called the 1027 Healing and Resiliency Center. So they organize activities to help people in the community. So you don't need to have any direct relationship to the synagogue. Just anybody, you know, who feels affected can go there. Obviously, the pandemic has stopped the in-person activities, but they have all kinds of activities online. You know, but maybe, you know, speaking to that, I'll read, I was going to do this in order of how they appear in the book, but I think I'll read now something that really speaks to resilience. So I have an essay here, except that I have to get the pages in the right order. I have an essay here by a reporter. So I should say something about the different people in the anthology. My co-editor and I, and feel free to ask questions afterwards about anything about putting the anthology together, but my co-editor and I, our prime criteria in putting this anthology together was to find writers, to find people that knew how to process events in writing. It wasn't just people that had good stories. There's an oral history project at the History Center for people that want to tell their stories, and that's an important thing. But for an anthology, we really thought that the writing had to be professional quality. So we asked writers, journalists, we consider rabbis, people that are professional writers because they give sermons and write all the time. We have a poet whose work I'm going to read in a little bit. But the piece I'm going to read now is by Campbell Robertson. He's a national reporter for the New York Times. He's based in Pittsburgh. At the time of the shooting in October 2018, he'd been living in Pittsburgh for about a year and a half, and he hadn't done any Pittsburgh-based stories. He's based in Pittsburgh, but he'll go to Kentucky or Ohio or West Virginia or wherever he's needed for a story. So he hadn't done anything in Pittsburgh. And the essay in the book is titled Keith Way. Keith Way is an alley right near Tree of Life, and it's where he stood. He got an alert on his phone very shortly after the shooting started, and so he went there while the gunman was still at large in the building. So he stood at an alley at a remove from the synagogue while everything was going on. And he talks about the perspective from that alley. And an excerpt from this essay appeared on Tuesday in the Religion News Service, which is a syndicated news service. So I'm going to read the excerpt from that essay, which is by Campbell Robertson, who's a national reporter for the New York Times. In the days after the Tree of Life shooting 2 years ago, the response was similar to what it was in Las Vegas, Sutherland Springs, San Bernardino, and so on. Vigils were crowded to overflowing, strangers embraced and wept, funerals were packed. Lines that normally mapped out the city's different communities were ignored, and Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and Jews, Black, Pittsburghers, and white mourned together. A man who had already made thousands of white crosses for shooting victims drove from Illinois and planted 11 of them with Stars of David affixed. A logo was drawn up, T-shirts made. The city promised not to back down. There's a template now, a crowdsourced manual. The incoming reporters are already familiar with the gun laws, the Justice Department with the grieving process, the mayors with ways to commemorate, having learned from the experiences of their fellow chief executives in Orlando, Parkland, Newtown. The list went on, has gone on since, and it will go on. Still, when you report on these things over and over, as I have as a correspondent for the New York Times, you become attuned to the differences. In Charleston, where a white supremacist killed 9 people at a Bible study at the Mother Emanuel Church, the reaction was different from what had come before. Yes, there was a template for grieving that horror too, but it was a very old one, long kept but largely hidden from the eyes of white society, updated again and again and again. Violence is by its nature shocking, but white supremacist violence in particular in this country is apple pie familiar. What had happened at Mother Emanuel on a June night in 2015 fit onto a clear timeline that went straight back to the execution of church members in 1822 for allegedly plotting a slave rebellion, and went on long before that too. Everyone understood this, even if they tried to deny it. It's still unknown what prompted the Las Vegas shooting, but as soon as you heard about Charleston, there wasn't any doubt. What was worse, a mass killing that made no sense at all, or one that did? My wife is Jewish. I'd gone to years of Passover Seders and mumbled gamely along to the Hanukkah blessings that my older daughter knew by heart by the time she was 5. But I came from a family of devoted Baptists. The basic wiring is different. How you react to suffering, how you see your duty to respond, who has the duty to forgive, to what degree you feel that pain is inevitable. All of this is in the genetics of a person's faith, more nature than nurture. I have my instincts here, and I don't see myself abandoning them. Still, my wife's ancestors were formed by priests in the Temple of Solomon at the same time that my own ancestors, as Benjamin Disraeli put it to the Irishman, were brutal savages in an unknown island. Not long after the shooting, I was walking through Squirrel Hill to a press conference a couple of blocks from the synagogue, stopping people on the sidewalk for short interviews. Many were returning from services and without phones on the Sabbath, familiar with only the vague details of the morning, asking whether I had heard the whereabouts of this or that person, though by and large the Jewish community of Squirrel Hill would know the precise toll long before the reporters did, because it was known who showed up at the JCC that afternoon and who didn't, who always showed up early to services at Tree of Life and who didn't. They talked of the anti-Semitic episodes around Pittsburgh in years past, hate murders that took place 32 and 18 years earlier, but also acts of vandalism, one-off assaults, things that at the time had seemed like outliers. Things in the country were getting ugly, an older man said, his wife nodding slowly beside him. Echoes of what family members who had come over from Europe used to talk about. As terrible as this horror was, it might well be a vanguard of horrors to come. This was said with something like self-reproof. Of course, this is the way of things, comforting and familiar as Squirrel Hill is. It is not apart from the world. It was naive to think otherwise. A different page missing. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay, Pittsburgh had thankfully broken one part of the usual pattern, the part about how Gentiles behaved. The city had wrapped its arms around the Jewish community. This had virtually never followed violent anti-Semitism in its long history. The store windows on Forbes Avenue, from the Dunkin' Donuts to the Chinese noodle shops, were billboards of love and support. In another time, as I had heard observed more than once, what happened to glass windows in Jewish neighborhoods would have been very different. Away from Gentile eyes, the old template was carried out with the Chevra Kadisha, those who wash the dead and prepare them for burial, collecting blood at the crime scene, and the recital of the mourner's Kaddish at nearly a dozen gravesides. Shivas unfolded, one starting after another, after the one before that, like a funereal fugue. The Shiva on Halloween night was for Dr. Rabinowitz, one of the most extraordinary men I've ever heard about. I had gotten to know him only in conversations and news articles after his death, seeing photos of his bow tie and kind smile, learning, among many other things, that he had helped men suffering from AIDS in the days when few else would. I sat quietly toward the back of a meeting room as friends and family stood up front and talked about Dr. Rabinowitz, but also about what had happened in a way that was to me surprisingly frank, stripped of false comfort. The story from the Talmud was told about Adam and Eve and the first sunset, how they believed that the darkening of the world meant a return to chaos and the coming of death, and how they spent the long night weeping together, how with the breaking of dawn, Adam came to realize that this, in fact, was the order of the world, that light is followed by darkness and darkness by light. I slipped out of the Shiva room not long after, walked past the wet and shiny trick-or-treaters on that Halloween night, and I sat in my car in the dark, almost in a daze. Right now, the phrase of the moment is social distancing. You never know who you are walking among, who is carrying a lethal pathogen, no matter how familiar your surroundings or routine the errand. Gathering for shul on an ordinary Saturday morning, for example, the courier of your death can show up anytime, anywhere. But the main reason for social distancing is so the hospitals are not overwhelmed. The idea is to slow and spread out the outbreak so that those who are most in need of help are able to get it before the hospitals collapse. The whole system is terrifyingly vulnerable. Keeping it afloat so that it's there when we need it one day ourselves requires a hyper consciousness of everyone around us. You can go through life thinking you are at a safe distance from the dangers of the world or from the suffering of strangers, but in either case, you are perilously deluded. On the last day before things started shutting down for the coronavirus, I drove my daughter to school. I thought about Dr. Rabinowitz and about the Midrash. Darkness falls everywhere when the sun sets, When it's night at the synagogue, it's just as much night in the alley across the street, but the dawn comes everywhere too. So one of the things that I found most remarkable about this essay is that here is a non-Jewish writer. His wife is Jewish and his children were going to preschool at a synagogue. And he was really able to absorb the Jewish teachings. The Midrash is from, I looked it up, it's from Avodah Zarah 8a. I think it's also in Breshit Rabbah, but it was just really incredibly moving to me that he, as part of his reporting, really absorbed the message of this Midrash. And I think that really speaks to the Jewish idea of resiliency, that even though it's dark everywhere, it's also dawn everywhere. So to me, that's a very important message of resiliency, you know, that there's a time to kill and a time to heal.
Yeah, all very moving, these passages, for sure. I only have one more question on my mind, so
Sure.
I do want to invite folks to.
Oh, I was going to do another reading, or you can have Q&A, whatever. That's up to you.
Well, why don't you go ahead and do that? Tell us what that. What.
Sure. Okay. So I think the last reading that I'll end with, I had two choices, but I'm going to choose this one, is by Arlene Weiner, and she is a poet and a playwright active in several poetry groups in Pittsburgh. She's been a Shakespeare scholar, a college instructor, a cardiology technician, and an editor. Ragged Sky published 2 collections of her poetry, Escape Velocity and City Bird. Arlene earned her PhD in English and American Literature at Brandeis and has held a fellowship to the McDowell Colony. And she's in my book group, so I've known her for a long time. I always, when the JCC was open, I would always see her at the JCC. She also lives very close to the Tree of Life building, and she's a member of Dor Hadash. So just to be fair, I've read one from a Tree of Life person, one from a reporter, and this is from a Dor Hadash person. The news came in. Cecil and David were dead. Joyce Feinberg was dead, a friendly woman I knew because we had both worked in the same institute at the University of Pittsburgh. Jerry Rabinowitz was dead. Jerry, there's a saying in Pirkei Avot, where there is no mensch, be a mensch, meaning not man in the macho sense, but human being, humane being. Jerry was that. About a month before the shooting, I was one of the congregation members whom Jerry organized to get the once-a-year high holiday books out of storage, a mundane task. Big books to be taken out of the closet, unpacked, and put on carts. I understand that on Saturdays, Jerry set up the room for the Torah study group, filling juice cups and putting them out. Possibly that's what he was doing on that Saturday. He was there early for that reason. Some physicians have an elite aura. You would never know that he was a doctor. I heard later that he was beloved by many for having treated patients with HIV during the peak of the AIDS crisis, holding their hands with his own ungloved hand. Another mensch, a mainstay, one of the founders of a group for the compassionate care of the dead, and I think the man who invoked the blessing of peace for all the inhabitants of Israel, was grievously wounded. A woman and 6 of the police who responded were wounded. The shooter was wounded. On that Saturday morning, 11 of the congregants of 3 congregations were killed by a weapon of war. The shooting tore the fabric of a beloved community. I wrote shortly afterward, I have been feeling my emotional bones, wondering why they are not broken. Why am I not shivering and crying? Am I hard-hearted? No, I'm not hard-hearted. I'm not inured to violence. Rather, both my personal and historical memory make me conscious of the possibility of violence and the possibility of anti-Jewish acts. As a Jew of a certain age, I'll say she's in her late 70s, I have never felt completely secure. I grew up in New York, my immediate neighborhood predominantly Irish. On the street near my apartment house where we played jump rope and ball bouncing games, I was not entirely at ease. My neighbors all went to Catholic school and I went to public school, which made a difference between us. But I was known and knew them. A little further away in the neighborhood, I might be bullied and taunted by strangers. At school, I was at ease. Some of my classmates were the children of Jewish refugees from Europe. We were children. I didn't know what that meant, but I learned later. I'm conscious of past and present anti-Jewish feelings and actions, and I'm conscious of past and present gun violence. So when the shooting happened, I was shocked, not surprised. And the name of her essay is Shocked, Not Surprised. So now I'm going to read the poem that she wrote, Tree of Life. I marked myself safe on Facebook when the alert came. Active shooter in my neighborhood. Is safe a lie if you want to believe it? I never feel safe. When I was 8, my playmate Patsy came home from her school and asked me, "Why did you kill Christ?" I had no answer. Ambushed by strangers near the synagogue, I spilled my Hebrew school books, their top-heavy black letters. At Halloween, I defended my kid brother, socked with nylons full of powdered chalk, his jacket marked unsafe. I saw a movie of bulldozers burying skeletal dead. Shelter in place, the notice said. My friends and neighbors text, and I tell you, stay safe. Not long after the Tree of Life shooting, Brad Orsini, then the director of security for the local Jewish community, a former FBI man, taught a security training session, very well attended, for members of Dor Hadash. As part of the training, we saw a short film of people in an airport immediately after a gunman opened fire. One man froze, standing, a perfect target. Sometimes people run, but collect in one place, also making slaughter easy. Orsini told us that the Department of Homeland Security has worked out a simple to remember formula for active shooter situations, a phrase that they hope to make as familiar as stop, drop, and roll in the case of fire. Run, hide, fight. Are children in school learning this now? So now I'm going to read the poem, Security Training, Stop the Bleed. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security advises remembering, run, hide, fight. Run, escape if you can, walk across Russia to Austria, get on a train to Rotterdam, emigrate to Cuba, which has an unfilled quota. Hide, shelter in place, shave your beard, bleach your hair, get a nose job, change your name. Fight, as a last resort. Look around you. Everyday objects can become weapons. Hot coffee, pencils, throw accurately and with force. Strike without apology. Run, hide, fight. Never again, again, again. After the shooting, there was a tremendous outpouring of ceremony and acknowledgement within Pittsburgh and from around the world. Television stations set up canopies in a literal encampment around the site. Signs saying "Hate has no home here" appeared in store windows and on lawns. That I doubt, as Black people will tell you, but it's an aspiration, a hope. And the people, the wonderful people who are a community supporting each other, give me hope.
Beth, before we open this up, just one quick but important question.
Sure.
What is the status of the Tree of Life community and the facility itself?
Okay. So the building is Tree of Life, and there's a shul Tree of Life. And in that building were 2 synagogues that were tenants, our own synagogue, New Light. And as Elaine was schmoozing with me at the beginning, you heard we had a building on Beechwood Boulevard that we sold to a Chabad, and we decided to become renters in different synagogues. We decided that we didn't need the physical facility, but that we would stay together as a synagogue by renting space elsewhere, not having our own building. So we rented space in Tree of Life. And another group, a Reconstructionist congregation called Dor Hadash, also rented space there as well. And you heard people talk about Joe Rabinowitz, who was the Dor Hadash member who was killed, and 3 of our own congregants, Richard Gottfried, Daniel Stein, and Melvin Wax, were killed. And the 7 others who were killed were members of Tree of Life. So New Light is now renting space at Beth Shalom in Pittsburgh, which is on Beacon and Shady, for those of you who know Pittsburgh. It's a very high building, sort of at the top of a hill. And Dor Hadash and Tree of Life are renting space at Road of Shalom, which is a big Reform synagogue on 5th Avenue. It's the home of the Pittsburgh Platform, for those of you familiar with it. And Dor Hadash signed a 5-year contract, I believe it's 5 years, with Rodef. We signed a 5-year contract with Beth Shalom. And Tree of Life, I know they hired a consultant, but I don't think that they've made any plans yet. I think there are various reasons. I think it's just too difficult to make a decision. I think people have various ideas about what they should do and how they should do it. But I think they're planning to have different tenants when they do return. They're going to partner with the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh. I think is going to rent space there, and Chatham College, which is sort of essentially across the street. It's kind of
Right.
across the street and a ways down, which is a women's college, or maybe it's a university now. I think they have some master's programs, and it's not only women. It's, I believe, co-ed. Will also be renting space from them. So there are no definite plans.
But you think it's plausible that people are going to return to the Tree of Life?
The thing is that I'm not involved anymore
Okay.
because
Okay.
our congregation signed a lease with a different congregation. So it's not up to me. So I don't know. And I have to say, I'm relieved that we don't have to be part of that conversation, because I think it's very complicated.
Very hard.
You know, whenever people from Israel come, they're astonished. And maybe some of you read Danny Gordis's piece in Mosaic, which I felt was a little bit below the belt, kind of criticizing all kinds of things about American Jewry because Tree of Life hasn't gone back. And I think it's a very different thing, you know, for a restaurant or some kind of other site in Israel to go back shortly after shooting than a synagogue. And I will say we went to Charleston in January 2019. So if you remember, they had their Bible study on a Wednesday night, and that Sunday they were back in the sanctuary. And a lot of them think it's a mistake. They think it was too quick, and they should not have necessarily gone back. And there haven't been physical changes to the building. They held their Bible study in the basement, and the only bathroom in the building still is in the basement. So if you're there and you need to use the bathroom, you have to walk through that basement. And a lot of the survivors, I think there were 3 survivors from that shooting, and they've all left the church since then. So, you know, I think it's a very complicated thing, and I'm pleased to say that all of the people who survived the shooting attend services every Shabbat. One is on Zoom, but the other 2 are in shul on Shabbat, and the family members of the victims who are shul members are still members. You know, people haven't left because of fights about the building and things like that. So I'm pleased to say that did not happen here in Pittsburgh. So hopefully we learned from what happened there. But you know, going back too quickly has its costs also. I guess I'm trying to point that out.
So let's open this up. I don't see a question in the chat room. Why don't we just unmute yourself and proceed?
I'm also happy to read. I have other things to read from as well. If
we covered a lot of ground, that is for sure.
Okay.
You really have. In the meantime, giving folks a few more minutes to think, your motivation to put this together, this book.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe you should mention where people can buy it, where you're going to put the link in.
Yeah, I think in the chat, I actually did. I thought I put the link. But I'll do that now.
Yeah, if you can do that, yeah, while I'm speaking. So yeah, so as I mentioned, our synagogue, New Light, went to Charleston in January 2019 on Martin Luther King weekend, and we went with members of the Rodman Street Baptist Church, who, as I mentioned, we've had this relationship with because my husband's a chaplain. One of the volunteers at the hospice he was working at goes to that church, and he'd spoken to them about visiting the sick and things they can do. And we've had Martin Luther King services with them, and we've had joint study groups. One thing they were doing was Proverbs, because it's the joint wisdom tradition. So we went to Charleston, 7 members from New Light and 2 members from Rodman and an African-American minister from another church. And when we got back, I asked people to write up their reflections and come to my house. This is obviously pre-COVID, and discuss our reflections. And so I was planning to type up everyone's reflections and send it to our hosts. We went to, so in Charleston, the historic downtown has the very old Reformed synagogue. It's, I think, the 3rd or 4th oldest in the country, as well as an Orthodox synagogue. The conservative synagogue moved out to the suburbs. So since we were staying downtown, we went to the Reform and the Orthodox synagogue, and then we went to the church, and we marched in the MLK parade with the church and with the Federation there. And so I thought it'd be nice to type these reminiscences up and send it to our hosts. I never did that, but I did think, you know, it'd be really interesting to have these reminiscences and other things in an anthology, and I could put together the writing, and I would reach out to the archivist at the Heinz History Center, who's the custodian of all the objects left at the site, and he could provide photos of objects, and we could just put something together. I thought maybe the Heinz History Center could like sort of self-publish it and sell it there and at the synagogue websites. I didn't think of it as sort of a large project. And Eric Leege, my co-author, my co-editor, sorry, said, well, why don't we focus on local history? Why don't we ask local people to write about this from their perspective? And I said, okay, great. And so that's what we did. So we sort of thought about, during the year, we thought about different people we could ask. We thought about different events. And I think around this time, I think around the time of the 1-year anniversary, we kind of started getting serious and writing everything up, and we created a proposal. And in January 2020, we went to the University of Pittsburgh Press. Eric had a contact there, and you know, we sort of thought, well, we'll see what they say, and if they're not interested, then we can, you know, self-publish it or look for something else. But fortunately, they were very interested and said, okay, you know, if you want it to be published on October 27th for the anniversary, let's figure out what the deadlines need to be. And we just did everything very quickly. One of the writers, Peter Smith, who's a religion journalist at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and was part of the team that won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of the shooting. Peter Smith said to us, well, the best muse is a deadline. So we kind of made sure everybody had their muse. We gave them all a deadline, and they wrote pieces. Now, there were people who had said initially they would write things and they didn't come through. Then there were people who, at the last minute, I asked to write something, and they did come through. So it's, you know, that always happens with these kinds of projects. So that's the making of the project.
Okay, so we did actually have a request to close out our program, Beth, to read another passage that we really find these passages to really bring us so much closer to this event. So if you can do that, and I think then we can, you know, begin to conclude.
Sure. Do you want me I can answer, you know, I see the two questions. Eli Chavivi, who was my Rosh Machaneh at Ramah and the Poconos. So I'd even, when I was mentioning Ramah and the Poconos, I'd forgotten that you were here, Eli. So, you know, big influence on my life. Thank you. Is asking me to read from the Eila Ezkara that my husband wrote. I don't think I can read it without crying, so I'm not going to. I'm sorry.
Beth,
but
this is Lauren Roth. I put a little note in the chat that I'd just like to make one comment.
Sure.
Okay, first, thank you very much for this excellent evening and reflection. One of the frequent comments is that I have heard, and we all thought, was, isn't it this amazing that the most severe anti-Semitic act that maybe, you know, certainly in the United States, but occurred here in Pittsburgh against the background of the collaboration and respect and mutuality that really does define this community, as you noted in your readings. And it was so ironic. We had a wonderful physician, I'm a psychiatrist physician, who moved his entire family here, very famous person, I'm not going to mention his name, from France.
Yeah, his son is our neighbor. His son lives across the street from me.
Yes. So here he moved his
No,
family.
we had them in our house 2 weeks before the shooting, this family that moved from France to combat anti-Semitism. And they said to us, you know, the wife, who's a physician herself, said, You know, I was going on the day of the Hyper Cache shootings to pick up my kids from school. I couldn't decide if I should pick my kids up and then get the challah, or get the challah from the Hyper Cache and then pick my kids up. So she picked her kids up and first and wasn't at the market. And it just seemed the most absurd thing to me. Like, how could there possibly be a shooting here? And 2 weeks later there was. I mean, it's just really ironic. You know, 2 weeks before, I thought it was the furthest thing from my mind. And
Well, there's
apparently Dr. Sahal's wife said to Rabbi Wasserman, "For this I left Paris."
I won't make any comment because it's just unexplainable. Okay.
Unexplainable. It's unexplainable,
But here we are.
Here we are. Yeah. No, you know, I did want to answer David Bachman's question, how do we see it? So Dor Hadash, the Reconstructionist congregation had a highest Shabbat, and suppose, you know, we don't know exactly what the shooter's motivation was, but he wrote a lot of anti-immigrant things, and supposedly he was looking for somewhere that had a highest Shabbat. And that's why he came. And my mother says that when she was in Pittsburgh last year on Rosh Hashanah, someone at Beth Shalom said to her, you know, we had a highest Shabbat also, which I remember that they did, but, you know, we had our highest Shabbat and someone forgot to send the check in, and we weren't listed on the official group of highest Shabbats. So he went to Tree of Life and not to Beth Shalom. You know, I don't know whether that's true, but that's what my mother says someone told her, so it could be. But you know, I you know, my understanding is that it was an anti-immigrant thing that the shooter was responding to. So I think it sort of fits into all of those categories. Jews are seen as others, and immigrants by white supremacists, and I think it's very important. As I said, you know, we've had this long-term relationship with this African-American church. We went to Charleston. I think it's really important that we ally ourselves with other people that white supremacists don't like. So I think you know how I'm voting. I'll stop it there. Do you want me to conclude with? I can conclude with another passage if you want.
Yes, we can do that, but just full disclosure, Lauren Roth happens to be another one of my cousins from Pittsburgh. So, in fact, most of the people on the Zoom call are my cousins.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. Right. Just brought all these people together. Yeah. Why don't you read one more passage? That would be great. If there's another question, we may have time for that. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. You know, I'm just trying. I was going to read something. I mean, it's fairly short. So, but it's fairly short. So, okay. So this is a very moving story. It's a story of a woman whose daughter was murdered when she was a senior in high school in their backyard, and it happens to be that she was murdered on October 27th. So, and this woman was getting ready to go to shul on the morning of October 27th, 2018 for her daughter's yard site. So that's where this opens. Oh, and I should read her bio. Her name is Linda Hurwitz, and she's the former director of the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh from 1988 to 2005. Under her supervision, the all-volunteer project with many local Holocaust survivors produced the book Flares of Memories, Stories of Childhood During the Holocaust, edited by Anita Brostoff with Sheila Shamowitz. She was an English teacher and head of the middle school at Community Day School for 10 years, and a teacher at Carnegie Mellon, Osher Lifetime Learning, and other adult education programs at Chatham College and at the University of Pittsburgh's Informal Studies. Shall I go to services for Karen's yard site this morning? My husband asked on the Drury morning of October 27th, 2018. It was 29 years on this exact date since our precious daughter was murdered right in our backyard. Karen had her bat mitzvah in the chapel of Tree of Life Synagogue on May 4th, 1985, her 13th birthday. She chose the intimate setting. She was a shy person, sensitive and serious. She liked to read and was a wonderful writer. Being an only child, she sometimes found it hard to take the teasing of her peers and often wound up being taken advantage of because she trusted others and wanted to help them. I remember the beautiful wood and the charm of that synagogue full of caring friends and family and teachers from community day school who knew her well. At Shabbat dinner of October 26, 2018, with friends and family that knew her well, we shared good, sweet memories of Karen. My mother, a 97-year-old Holocaust survivor, recalled that Karen worked at a hostess at the Eden Park restaurant during her senior year and how proud she was to have her grandma see her in her uniform. A dear friend whose children grew up with her remembered Karen preparing for her college interviews at Emerson College and Boston University, helping her choose what to wear, putting her on the plane just 3 weeks before her death. As part of her application, Karen had written about her summer internship at WQED, working for Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, and how she loved to write and hoped to pursue journalism. I recall how excited Karen was to go to the Cheers bar and restaurant after the Boston interviews, as she loved the TV show. Her aunt and uncle added memories of Karen enjoying their 3 children who grew up just around the corner from us. We all knew that we would never forget that date, October 27, 1989, when Karen was brutally strangled and stabbed to death. This year, 29 years since our lives were broken by the brutality perpetrated on her, we chose to recall the finer times. We went to bed trying to focus on the long ago images, on her goodness as a young woman with college applications on her desk and her future still ahead of her. Now, it was a month since we had all been together in the sanctuary of Tree of Life for the high holidays. During the Yizkor memorial service, we had each reflected on those who were no longer with us. On this Saturday morning, I felt sad and tired, and the reality of the forever loss of her and her future made me feel listless. This bitter taste had me feeling lethargic, thus I had not gotten dressed yet. My husband went up the street to put air in his bike tires and said that when he returned, we could decide if we felt like going up the 4 blocks to Tree of Life for services. On his way home, he saw police cars and heard sirens in our neighborhood. When we turned on the TV, we were shocked. Our Tree of Life was under attack. It was incomprehensible that where we had been just weeks before, fellow congregants were being murdered. I pictured us seated all together, enjoying the high holiday services midway down the main sanctuary. I pictured Joyce Feinberg handing me the prayer book and Irv Younger telling people when to be ready to come up for an aliyah. I recalled meeting and hearing this new Rabbi Jeffrey Myers trying to get to know his new congregants. Now he was being thrust into the line of fire. Like the Tree of Life murderer, Karen's killer brought his weapon intent on violence out of his own meaningless, distorted rage. For the rest of us, it's impossible to imagine that kind of violent intent toward good, innocent people. Even having studied the unspeakable torture and brutality of the Holocaust, when violence happens to someone you know, in your home, in your world, you gain only a fraction of understanding of what others have experienced. You learn, like I did from the Holocaust survivors I knew so well, that each of us has resources deep within us that will serve us to give you the strength to go on with life. In response to this call I had to make, my parents, knowing from their own suffering and survival that we have a strong will to live, said, "You will get through it. You will get through it." My mother was born in Lodz, Poland, to a large, very educated, financially comfortable family. Her father was the oldest of 7 siblings and her mother one of 8. My mother was adored by her parents and grandparents and even had great-grandparents growing up. She believed that if you were loved and fortunate enough to have secure, happy, formative years, you had the self-assurance to rebound when you had to face adversity. She was very close to her father particularly and often quoted his philosophy of life. Her family was not religious, but they raised her to believe in herself and in the reality that under all conditions, one had to be able to respect oneself for one's actions and decisions in life. The families of the victims of the Tree of Life massacre will find within themselves the strength to go on, to give themselves the time to grieve and mourn and eventually move forward step by step. They have had to face the initial publicity and will again have to face the press and the perpetrator if a trial does occur. We had 2 trials and many additional hearings to face over those 30 years, every time dredging up again the pain and anger and injustice of the situation. The people of each synagogue will have to decide, as we did, if they can rebuild their home and return to the facility where the actions occurred. Do they want to give the perpetrator the victory of taking away their place of worship? Can the sanctity be restored? Can it be cleansed and restored? Can one return? We stayed in our home. We converted Karen's bedroom into a nursery. We transformed the area of the murder for our new family. Ultimately, we were glad we did not let the killer take us from the home and yard we had loved. We wanted our children to share this space with their sister. It was not always comfortable, but we stayed where as a family we had experienced happiness, sadness, and happiness again. It held many memories. If you are related to the victims, you will now be associated with them and this event into the future. We are forever marked as the ones whose daughter was murdered. The first few years after she was killed, we got a place outside of Pittsburgh so that we did not feel so conspicuous when out in public. On weekends, we went there with friends and family with whom we could be ourselves. As we got better, we almost felt as though we had to apologize for not seeming to be grieving as much. We felt that people talked about us with the best and most compassionate intentions, but it made us feel self-conscious. People often call me by my daughter's name, which shows they think of the event and her in association with me. Today, this still happens. I had to find the words that felt comfortable when asked by new people I would meet, "How many children do you have?" When people ask, I pause and say 1 deceased and 2 living. I could not answer questions simply and be truthful and inclusive. Did I owe an explanation to everyone I would meet in the future? The survivors of the shooting and those related closely to those who died will feel this attachment and label as part of their identity forever. Choosing words carefully to honor those who are gone, deciding whether to say something to strangers is always a challenge. The tenderness one feels on the initial anniversaries becomes easier with experience and acceptance of what happened. Always, certain dates, anniversaries, associations trigger a renewal of grief. However, as my wise mother and father said, you will get through it. You will learn better coping skills. You will learn how to live with this trauma, forever changed, but knowing that your loved one lives on through you and all who remember him or her. Finding a way to honor the life of the loved one who was killed is important. Establishing something that reflects his or her values and interests helps to give you a sense of purpose for the future. Our daughter loved to read and write, and we supported several literary magazines, and the library at her Jewish day school was named for her. A friend of ours who lost an adult child created a golf tournament in her daughter's honor. Another friend designs cards that raise money for scholarships in memory of her deceased child. Keeping that person in your life, sustaining the memories, honoring how one lived, not how one died, inspires and strengthens. I hope each victim's family member and each friend is fortunate enough to have a support system and the inner strength and resiliency to overcome the shock of October 27th, a date of dread and sadness. I hope, as with my loss and sadness, that each survivor finds the building blocks to go on and honor life with life.
Beth, I want to personally just reflect on how powerful this evening was for me, and I'm sure I'm reflecting how others are feeling as you help to lead us through this difficult memory. But I can also say that in reference to this passage you just read, that there really are values that survive. And I have to say that you have helped us to identify those values, to recall those values and how important they are, and how much you embody those values in the work that you've done in producing this book that is so very valuable. So I want to thank you on behalf of all of us who are on this call. Just to remind those who are on this call that there was an article today, I believe it was in the Bergen Record, about your work, and those of you who have access to it, you might find that to be enlightening. And also to remind you that this book is available now, published, called Bounding in the Bond of Life. And I've put into the chat box a reference, a link to get more information about how to purchase the book. And so with that, I'm going to close this session out to thank you again and to thank everyone else for participating in this important evening.
Yeah, I just want to thank Dennis and everybody at Beth Shalom, all of the support staff. You know, I know there's an adult education committee. I'm not sure who's on it, but you know, thank everybody. Oh, Ephraim Reese, who's from Squirrel Hill. His father was a rabbi at New Light for many years. People still remember his father of blessed memory. Ephraim Reese came and was very helpful to us, just doing things that we weren't really functioning enough to do that first week. So, you know, thank you. I haven't looked at all the windows of people just in the chat, but thank you, Ephraim, for being here and all you've done. for us. Yeah, so I really just, want to thank you. It's really meaningful to me to be able to share the stories and memories of the people here. Actually, maybe I'll just close, just read the names of the victims in English and Hebrew, because, I really want to make sure that's what this is about. We read things in the news, and these are 11 people from 9 families, because there were 2 brothers and a husband and wife. And so the yard site is actually the 18th of Cheshvan. Tonight is, I believe, the 12th. Yesterday was the 11th with his Rabin's yard site. But next Wednesday night and Thursday is the 18th of Cheshvan. So that's the actual yard site date. Unfortunately, it's easy to remember. And if you want to keep those people in mind, then that would be appropriate. I'm not sure what will happen in years to come, if we'll keep doing the secular and the Jewish date, or if only the Jewish date's going to become important. But I'm going to read the names of the 11 Pittsburgh martyrs. Joyce Feinberg, Edith Balcha bat Abba Menachem, Richard Gottfried, Yosef Ben Chaim, Rose Mallinger, Razel bat Avraham, Jerry Rabinowitz, Yehuda ben Yechezkel, Cecil Rosenthal, Chaim ben Eliezer, David Rosenthal, David ben Eliezer, Bernice Simon, Bela Rachel bat Moshe, Sylvan Simon, Zalman Shachna ben Menachem Mendel, Daniel Stein, Daniel Avram ben Baruch, Melvin Wax, Moshe Gadol ben Yosef, Irving Younger, Yitzchak Chaim ben Menachem. Hashem yikom damam, may God avenge their blood, and tehei nishmatechem tzrurim b'tzrachayim, may their memories be bound in the bond of life.